Imagine the mid-1990s. The internet was still a novelty, mostly surfed from clunky PCs on dial-up. Then, in the summer of 1996, a small Silicon Valley startup unveiled something astonishing. It was a tiny set-top box that you could hook up to your living room TV, allowing anyone to surf the web with a remote and a keyboard. The device was called WebTV. It launched at around $350 a unit, with a monthly service fee of about $20 for unlimited web and email. Just weeks later, tech giant Microsoft paid $425 million to buy the company behind it. By all appearances, WebTV had made a huge splash. Yet despite the hype and deep pockets, it would become a classic story of being just a little too early. The vision for WebTV came from Steve Perlman, an engineer who had worked at Apple and on other advanced tech projects. Perlman had dreamed for years about interactive television. One night in the early 1990s, he was browsing a soup recipe site on a computer when something hit him. The people who would want those recipes probably didn't have internet access. What if instead of a PC, the TV could be the gateway to the web? This simple insight, that television might be a better home for the internet for many users, led Perlman to act. In the spring of 1995, he founded a company in Palo Alto and quickly brought in co-founders Bruce Leak and Phil Goldman. The trio assembled a team of talented engineers, including people from Apple and General Magic, to turn the idea into a product. Early on, they hid the project under the codename Artemis Research, joking on their website about sleep deprivation and dwarf rabbits. Behind the humour, however, was a serious plan. Build a low-cost internet terminal that licensed its design to consumer electronics makers. By mid-1996, the startup had around 70 people, many fresh out of Stanford or from Apple and General Magic. Among them were future tech names: Andy Rubin, who would later help create Android; Joe Britt, who would later work on Danger. The business model was simple. Consumer electronics giants like Sony and Philips would manufacture and sell the hardware. WebTV would collect monthly fees for the service, and the strategy worked. Sony signed on, Philips signed on. In July of 1996, WebTV hit the headlines as the world's first device to let ordinary people access the internet without a personal computer. By September 18, 1996, WebTV set-top boxes were on store shelves. One version came from Sony, another came from Philips. They sold for roughly $350, depending on the model. The optional wireless keyboard cost around $50 more, and after a free trial, the service cost about $20 per month. The WebTV hardware was modest by today's standards: a simple box, a MIPS processor, a couple of megabytes of RAM, and a 33.6 kilobit per second dial-up modem. But the software was carefully crafted. WebTV's central servers did the heavy lifting. Whenever a user browsed a website, the WebTV service would fetch the page, clean it up, reformat the text and images to fit a standard television screen, and send a simplified version back to the set-top box. The interface was built for 1990s televisions and people who were not comfortable with computers. Text was large, navigation was simple, the remote handled basic movement, and an orange light on the box could blink when new email arrived. Like a tiny notification light in your living room. In essence, WebTV was a purpose-built thin client for web and email on the biggest screen in the house. At first, the buzz was strong. The press loved the idea of internet television. Some reviewers saw it as a budget browser for the masses. Hotels even began installing WebTV units in guest rooms so visitors could get online without using a PC. But consumer adoption was slow. By the spring of 1997, WebTV had only sold into the tens of thousands of homes. The company would only say it had well over 50,000 subscribers. That number would rise, around 150,000 by late 1997, roughly 325,000 by the spring of 1998, and around 800,000 by 1999 under Microsoft. But compared to the millions of people already using PCs to go online, it was still small. Why didn't WebTV take off immediately? The easy answer is timing. In 1996, almost no one had broadband. WebTV used ordinary phone lines. That meant pages could take a long time to load. The web itself was also built for computer monitors, not old cathode ray televisions. Many sites needed horizontal scrolling. Some images broke, some buttons were hard to use, and the idea of surfing the internet from 10 feet away sounded better than it felt. The living room was comfortable, but the web was not built for the couch yet. At the same time, WebTV had one strange problem that made the story even weirder. Because it used strong encryption to communicate with its servers, the United States government briefly classified the devices as munitions under export rules. In other words, a little box sold in the electronics stores was treated technically like a weapon. Not because it could hurt anyone, but because the encryption inside it was considered sensitive technology. That is how early this world still was. The product was trying to make the internet casual, but the infrastructure around it still treated parts of the internet like military technology. And yet, despite all of that, the WebTV team had built something real. You could sit on the couch, press a button, open your email, look at a web page, read news, search for information, and do it all on the same television where your family watched shows at night. For people who had never touched a computer, WebTV made the internet feel less intimidating. It took the web off the desk and put it in the living room, and for a few years Silicon Valley paid attention. In early 1997, Microsoft's top executives began looking closely. During a meeting, Microsoft's senior executive Craig Mundy saw WebTV's potential. The subscriber numbers were modest. The product was imperfect. But the idea fit something Microsoft was already thinking about. A world where Windows and internet services could move beyond the traditional PC, appliances, televisions, living room devices. Then Bill Gates got personally involved. He reportedly called Steve Perlman on Easter Sunday to talk about WebTV's next-generation products. Within weeks, Microsoft made its move. On April 6, 1997, less than 2 years after WebTV had been founded, Microsoft announced it would acquire WebTV Networks. The deal was described as a major bet on internet television. The official value was over $500 million. But because many shares had not vested yet, the acquisition price announced at the time was $425 million in Microsoft stock. This was not a tiny experiment anymore. This was Microsoft saying that the internet might belong in the living room. With Microsoft's backing, WebTV had new resources. The founders stayed on. Microsoft promised to build a Silicon Valley campus around the team, and the product started to evolve. In 1997, WebTV launched a second-generation model called WebTV Plus. This was not just a browser box anymore. It added a TV tuner, composite video inputs, picture-in-picture, and a hard drive. You could watch television and browse the internet from the same device. You could capture still images from video. You could email those images to someone. You could even schedule a VCR through the set-top box, years before DVRs became normal in the living room. The hardware improved too: a faster processor, a faster modem, more advanced multimedia features. On paper, WebTV Plus looked like a preview of the connected living room. Internet, television, email, recording, interactive programming, all inside one box. This was 1997, years before Apple TV, years before Roku, years before smart TVs became normal, years before people casually opened YouTube or Netflix from a television remote. The idea was not wrong, it was just trapped in the wrong decade. Microsoft eventually folded WebTV deeper into its entertainment and online strategy. In 2001, the product was rebranded as MSN TV. The name WebTV slowly disappeared, replaced by Microsoft's bigger internet brand. Then, in 2004, Microsoft introduced MSN TV 2. This new version was basically a small PC for the television. It used a Celeron processor. It ran a version of Windows CE. It supported broadband Ethernet. It could work with Wi-Fi through adapters. The interface became more like a normal browser. You could scroll sideways, resize text, plug in a mouse, stream audio and video if you had broadband. At this point, the original vision was almost there. A web-connected box for the TV, a living room internet device, a bridge between television and computing. But there was another problem. While WebTV was improving, the world was changing faster. Broadband was spreading. PCs became cheaper. Laptops became more common. Phones started getting smarter. Game consoles started connecting to the internet. And other companies saw the same living room opportunity. America Online announced its own television internet service. TiVo was changing how people thought about recording TV. Streaming media was beginning to take shape. And eventually, video platforms would make the browser less important than apps. WebTV had imagined the connected television correctly, but it imagined it through the browser. through email, through dial-up, through a remote pointed at a slow web page. The future would arrive differently. It would arrive through broadband, through apps, through Wi-Fi, through streaming, through YouTube, through Netflix, through boxes and consoles and smart televisions that were powerful enough to make the internet feel natural on a big screen. That was the problem. WebTV proved the concept, but it could not make the experience feel effortless, and consumer technology only becomes huge when it feels effortless. Microsoft's support slowly faded. The subscriber base plateaued. Dial-up became old. The name MSNTV kept the service alive, but the momentum was gone. By the early 2000s, the idea of getting internet on a television was no longer shocking, but WebTV itself felt dated. The first product had been too limited. The later products came too late, and the market moved around it. By 2003, WebTV and MSNTV had under 1 million total subscribers, respectable for a niche product, but nowhere near the mainstream future Microsoft once imagined. In 2004, MSNTV2 tried to modernize the idea, but by then, the living room was filling with other devices: DVD players, game consoles, media boxes, computers, and later, actual smart TVs. The thing WebTV had predicted was finally coming, but not through WebTV. In September 2013, after roughly 17 years, Microsoft shut down the WebTV and MSNTV service. The remaining users were moved toward ordinary internet options. The explanation was simple. Since the launch in 1996, the internet had changed dramatically, and there were now many other ways to get online: tablets, smartphones, laptops, game consoles, smart TVs. The box that once promised to bring the internet to the living room had been replaced by a world where everything was connected. And that is the strange part. WebTV lost because its dream came true. It did not fail because the idea was stupid. It failed because the version that existed in 1996 could not carry the future all the way by itself. The internet was too slow, television screens were too low resolution, websites were not designed for the couch. People did not yet expect their TV to behave like a computer, and the technology that makes today's smart TV feel normal simply did not exist at the right price, at the right speed, in the right homes. But the idea was there. Email on the television, web browsing from the couch, interactive programming, streaming audio, recording and scheduling. A screen in the living room connected to online services, that is not a failed idea. That is the outline of the modern living room. Every time someone opens Netflix on a television, they are living in the world WebTV tried to build. Every time someone watches YouTube from a remote, the basic idea is there. Every time a TV asks for a Wi-Fi password, installs apps, shows notifications, or streams media from the internet, the ghost of WebTV is somewhere inside that experience. Steve Perlman once said he had been working on interactive television his entire life, and in a way he was right to keep chasing it. Because television did become interactive, programming did become on demand, internet connectivity did become normal, the living room did become another place where the web lives. WebTV just arrived before the rest of the world was ready to meet it. That is what early technology often looks like. Not a mistake, not a joke, not a dead end, rough sketch of a future that needs better roads, faster networks, sharper screens, cheaper chips, and more time. WebTV was the smart TV before smart TVs. It was the living room internet before the living room had broadband. It was the app screen before apps became the language of television. It was a good idea trapped inside the wrong infrastructure. And that is why the story matters. Because sometimes the future does not fail because it is wrong. Sometimes it fails because it arrives alone. WebTV brought the internet to the television in 1996. The world just needed another decade to understand why that mattered.